on. I think you can hear me, Zoom, etc. My name is Rochelle Davis. I'm an associate professor in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and a sort of affiliate member of Earth Commons, and really happy to be part of Earth Commons and to be here today. I am tasked with introducing our speaker, and our speaker is Omar Tesdell, who is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Birzeit University in Palestine, and his research works to make more climate-adapted, resilient, and just agricultural landscapes. He holds a Ph.D. in geography and sustainable agriculture from the University of Minnesota and was also a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University in New York. I've known Omar for, on the margins of life, I've known Omar for probably almost 20 years or something. I remember we met at Birzeit University and we were talking about it in 2010. And so when the Earth Commons offered this opportunity to have faculty have input on sort of potential speakers, I thought Omar was a perfect person to do this. And you would be happy to know he has not, I am putting him to work. And so he's speaking in both of my classes. He spoke yesterday to one of my classes and he'll speak today to my freshman pro seminar. And last night we had a sort of a social hour with a social dinner with a whole bunch of students and faculty and former faculty and lots of other people from the community. So we're making the most of his time here. So it's been really great to have him amongst us. So please welcome Omar.
Thank you, Rochelle, for your introduction. I bring greetings from Palestine to these unceded traditional lands of the Piscataway peoples, and whose lands were taken a few grandmothers and grandfathers ago, and also to us and the many peoples who are immigrants to North America, who are not only the beneficiaries here, but also themselves historically embedded in relations of domination in their lands of origin. Before I start too, I also want to recognize the carnage currently wrought upon people in Palestine and Lebanon as we speak, and so many other parts of the world, including Congo and Sudan. Militarism and religious nationalism of all stripes only brings suffering. And it's wonderful to be here at Georgetown with this social justice tradition, Jesuit tradition, and especially in a hall named for Padre Arrupe, an inspiring figure for so many, I think, around the world, Latin America especially. I want to thank Professor Davis, Professor Adeli, the Earth Commons, Priscilla, Coco, and many others who made my visit possible here today. Working at a Global South university under occupation in Palestine, I have a new appreciation for the intellectual exchange that is possible here, and just how precious it is. Living in Palestine now for 11 years, I've also come to see colonization with greater nuance, and starting a seed collection and a native tree nursery, the first of its kind in our country, has been yielding valuable insights into how to do research under duress. So I'll start my paper. This paper is something that I've been working on now for about a year, and it's a deep dive into how olive trees enable survival and persistence of our community. Slide. Thank you. Olive trees are the great survivors of Palestine. They are also the last leg of Palestinian agricultural life left standing. The olive crop is the only crop of any food or economic significance left in Palestine today. So this paper asks a central question. Why, when Palestinian small-scale agriculture collapsed, trapped between worldwide economic shifts and Israeli military occupation, did the olive culture not only survive, but thrive? This paper addresses the question through an exploration of the biophysical and social dimensions of a crisis and the response of Palestinian farmers to it. While the socio-political and economic factors of increased olive production over the last 100 years has been recently and extensively explored by Jeffrey Rieger here on campus in 2018, among others, the biophysical dimensions that articulated with and underpin the transformation have not been well explored. My hypothesis is that two central factors play a role in the survival of local communities under great duress in Palestine. First, the biophysical attributes of perennial crops themselves lend themselves to survival. And second, economic and social infrastructure generated by economic and environmental crises within the last help them withstand the crises of the last 100 years. Further, it shows how local people around the Levant and other rural communities might respond to major climatic crises already underway. The question then becomes, what infrastructure is needed, not only to survive, but to adapt to our ongoing and deepening economic and environmental crises? So just a brief note, this is the only text, I apologize. The context that I'm working in is a Mediterranean climate. It's not a desert climate. It's a feast and famine climate. It's dry for 6 months and very, very wet for 6 months. We receive in the hill region approximately the same amount of rain that they do in many parts of Central Europe. But we receive it in 6 months only. The elevation where we work is about half a mile. The native ecosystem is a Quercus and Pistachia keystone species association, which is oak and a kind of pistachio relative. We are the center of origin for many important crops, including einkorn and emmer wheat, barley, oat, pea, lentil, chickpea, flax, all domesticated from wild crops in the area. And olive production is our main crop today. This is a map from Zohari, one of the most important histories of domestication. And you can see in Palestine, each leg on the circle is a crop that was domesticated. And you can see actually in Palestine, in Jericho, the archaeological evidence points to the most number of crops that were domesticated in a particular place in the Fertile Crescent region. So 2 kinds of wheat, barley, chickpea, flax, lentil, pea, all in Palestine there. In its recent history of the last couple hundred years, Palestinian peasants in the hill region were wheat and barley people. They relied mostly on wheat, barley, and lentil in the rainy season, and sesame, sorghum, and various vegetables in the dry season. By most accounts, the small grain and pulse agro-ecosystem for Palestinians was a difficult and marginalized life, which included lifetime indebtedness under feudal landlords located in about 20 crown villages in the Palestinian hill region. There's also an important agronomic note to make here. Small grain and pulse production at a small scale is incredibly laborious, and it lends itself to exploitation and slavery. This production, which is also documented in Palestine, for example, in the works of Omar al-Barghouti, among others. This production system requires annual cycles of tilling, planting, weeding, harvesting, and processing. It, moreover, is not possible to be a part-time wheat and barley farmer at a small scale because of the annual growth habit and the characteristics of these plants that require tillage. With the exception of cash crop citrus plantations on the coast and in some of in the Jordan Valley, the main fruit and nut trees were olives, grape, fig, almond, and they were concentrated in certain areas of the north central hill region of Ramallah, Nablus, and Salfit. Olives are by far the most important crop of the tree culture. The decline of the Ottoman Empire's domination of Palestine probably marked the low point in olive production in recent centuries. As Rieger's pioneering research has shown, the land under olive cultivation greatly expanded under World War I. At the end of the Ottoman period in Palestine, olive production grew under the British Mandate, the Jordanian period, and under Israeli occupation, it has grown substantially. In fact, according to Rieger's research, the area of olive cultivation tripled in the period after 1919 and then doubled again after 1948. Moreover, there were remnant monumental ancient olive trees found in many areas of the hill region, dating from the Byzantine or Rumi period and the early Islamic period, the Islami period, when the monastic economy built them up and supported their cultivation. To this day, often the oldest trees in the central hill villages are located close to the village core, where the Byzantine monasteries are located and the remains are located. Remarkably, there are nearly 300 olive presses in the West Bank and Gaza today. It's an area about the size of 4 counties in the United States, roughly speaking, in the middle of the United States. These are modern olive presses, mostly made in Italy. They take the olive crop from the growers, wash, clean, separate stems and leaves, heat up the olives, and finally using a spinning mechanism, press the olives. On traditional olive groves, 30 to 40 trees are found per acre, which is considerably less than, for example, irrigated plantations that you would find in Spain, Turkey, and Italy. Because we have almost exclusively rain-fed production, so relying exclusively on the rain. They are generally not irrigated. On average, olives produce about 22 to 25% oil per weight. So if you have 100 kilos of olives, you would get 22 to 25 kilos of oil. The remaining refuse is used for fertilizer or even sold as a fuel for wood-burning stoves or fireplaces. And it seems to be about an ancient ratio. Archaeological evidence points to 300 to 500 olive presses in the area of Palestine, according to the archaeological survey conducted by the Israeli occupation in the 1970s. I'll just show you what olive oil looks like coming out of the press. Anyway, it was a video, but that's the color. So then a major rupture occurred on 3 levels. First, the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank in 1967. Palestinian subsistence farmers were actively exposed to the Israeli labor market. In fact, they were recruited to work in coastal cities in agriculture and construction, among other sectors. This moved them from subsistence to wage labor, opening up the economy in new ways. Although, of course, the Palestinian economy and agrarian economy had always been part of the global economy. Second, small-scale farmers from their tiny corner of the planet were exposed to worldwide economic and agronomic shifts, including market liberalization and globalized supply chains. This exposure was due to a restructuring of the labor market and transformation from subsistence to wage labor. And third, to make matters worse, especially in the late 1970s and early 80s, the Israelis began an intensive colonization project in the West Bank, confiscating and buying land in the West Bank to build settlements. Today, there are 500,000 settlers located in 130 settlements, some small outposts and some as large as cities resembling suburban neighborhoods. Much of this confiscation, as some of you and many of you probably know, was conducted by restructuring Ottoman land law by the Israelis to allow for expropriation of land under the guise that it was uncultivated and therefore could be declared state land and therefore made it so it could be taken. So the overall result was that rural Palestinians en masse left small-scale agriculture and turned to wage labor. As noted above, the local agro-ecosystem until that point was structured on small grains and pulse production, namely wheat and barley. So Palestine was also unique given that its small size in this restructuring of the labor market meant that people didn't have to migrate and live permanently away from their homes. They could actually work in the coastal Israeli cities and come back. So basically, this paper turns on a major agroecological crisis that basically pinned Palestinians between a land confiscation project using the excuse that land was uncultivated on one hand in order to confiscate it for Israeli use. And second, the collapse of the rural grain-based agroecosystem that reduced their farming to part-time status. So what happens next is actually pretty remarkable. This crisis is set up by the 1980s, and Palestinian farmers, supported by local committees and other organizations, basically responded in a very unexpected way. They massively expanded the olive groves in response and expanded them out from the smaller historical areas where olives were normally grown into lots of areas, lots of new areas that had formerly been wheat and barley. And in doing so, they brought forth a new perennial agroecosystem to replace the annual grain agroecosystem. So within a couple of decades, a new forest of olive trees flourished across the West Bank. Importantly, and attendant social transformations also flourished as families began to take weeks or days in the month of October, like right now, to harvest the olives. Until now, many people take like a month off to harvest their olives, or just if they can't, work on weekends to be in the olives, as we say in the vernacular. Even at my university, actually tomorrow is a university holiday to allow people to have an extra day in the olives. It's become a central thread of the social fabric of the West Bank today, a sign of the attachment to the land. And as many joke in daily life, the only reason most people, including rural people, spend much time in the land these days is because of the olives. So the transformation is quite stunning if one takes a step back for one moment. When I ask my students at Birzeit University, the majority of whom hail from rural backgrounds, the vast majority of them no longer know the function, for example, of the baydar, or the threshing floor, which is a shocking fact. This is a historical photo of the threshing floor, which is a shocking fact given that the wheat was the backbone of Palestinian rural life literally for millennia. And these students are only 2 or 3 generations off of subsistence agriculture in a wheat culture that literally built the entire area up. So it's a pretty shocking decline in just a couple of generations. So there continues to be a lamenting of this decline of small-scale agriculture in Palestine by Palestinian nationalist tendencies and strains of the global political left. As they rightly point out, the dependency on grain imports has been created by the decline of Palestinian grains. However, I think, in my opinion, this work de-emphasizes 2 things, and this strain de-emphasizes 2 things. First, that the large-scale exploitation and gendered violence by Palestinian rural and urban elites that was required to maintain subsistence farming within land tenure systems. And second, the ecological costs of annual grain production, especially plowing the soil, which causes erosion, soil structure loss, soil organic matter loss. So de-emphasizing these costs and realities in the service of a kind of rigid theoretical category does a disservice, I think, to the damage that was exacted on Palestinian peasants and farmers and other ecological forces. In the early pioneering work, for example, of Sumaya Farhat Nasser of Birzeit University in 1980, olive trees were becoming of increasing importance in the West Bank. According to her study of this hill region, the area under olive cultivation increased 12% between 1969 and 1982 in just 13 years. Similarly, the work of Saeed Assaf, based on his own data from the Olive Oil Council, reports and fieldwork shows a major decline, 72% in weed production, and a massive increase, more than 600% in the tons of olives produced. And I just charted it on a little graph here, and you can see this is Saeed Assaf's data from 2010, but you can see a massive decline in small grains and a massive increase in the land area under cultivation of olives. In a seeming paradox, there was a steep decrease in the land area of wheat and barley. So then the expansion continues in the 1970s and 80s, and I don't really have time to go into this. I'm going to skip a whole section, but basically I wanted to just point to the fact that even in the 1920s, some of my research on the early 20th century arboriculture work of Najib Nassar, an early Palestinian land activist and nationalist and newspaper owner, illustrates this point very clearly. So in 1922, for example, in a dispatch that I translated here from the Marj ibn Amir, he counseled, which is the plain in the northern part of Palestine. He counseled local people who were at the front lines of dispossession in the Galilee. And he already in 1922, more than 100 years ago, could see the writing on the wall. So I'll just quote from his dispatch. "We met with local people and spoke with them about their narrow attitude, and we said there is no way out of the danger except the unceasing work of building the soil, its skillful cultivation and the planting of trees, that they should establish a treasury of 500 olive seedlings for each son of the village, that they do not sell their land to urban land brokers, some of whom have in turn sold the land, that they guard against embroilment in religion, and that they should educate their children both scientifically and practically. We saw the despair seeping into their being because of the lack of rain and the danger encircling them. So we encouraged them by telling them of the large cultivation efforts of olives of their brothers in the villages of Jenin, Tulkarim, and Nablus." End quote. In this seemingly bygone era, Nassar clearly understood the productive energy of arboriculture and its effects on Palestinian communities. It's interesting to me that he's not calling for wheat and barley production. He's calling for tree crop production. The establishment of groves of olives has the potential to reorganize relations between people and land and between people themselves. Trees enroll people into their rhythms. They provide an infrastructure for new forms of engagement. And Nassar inhabited this liminal space between development and arboriculture and called for solidarity across religion and class amongst Palestinians. So, for your sake, and for everyone else's, I'm going to skip over the rest of this section, which is the historical section of this paper, which is interesting, but we don't have time for. So the last two little sections of this paper are going to get down into the details of olive production and the propagation of olives, and then pose some questions to conclude. So for more than 100 years, Palestinians have been expanding their groves, which is, we've now proposed that this is a very new and surprising fact, given that olives are such an important part of the Palestinian national symbolism. So it's been heavily discussed in literature in the 1980s, beginning with Sumaya Farhat Nasser, Hisham Awartani, Firas Sawalha, and many others, including Saeed Assaf and others. However, in this next section, I want to explore the biophysical forces that are unique to these ancient modes of olive cultivation in the Mediterranean region. And I think part of the answer is not only social, but it's biophysical. So if we take a quick dive into the domestication history of the olive, wild olive trees are a scrubby evergreen tree in the Oleaceae family. They grow wild in the Mediterranean region. They are woody, evergreen, and have waxy sclerophyllous leaves, which is an adaptation to the Mediterranean dry summer period from May to November. That dry, wet pattern emerged about 3 million years ago, and gave these trees with waxy leaves basically an advantageous well, they adapted and spread given that new climate transformation. So there remains to be a debate as to the domestication origin of the olive. Of course, every country in the Mediterranean claims it to be theirs. So domestication was done by cloning because woody plants lend themselves to it. So for example, in the case of the almond, the wild almond is naturally bitter, bitter almond. And the sweet almond mutation was found by early domesticators and farmers. And this adaptation, which may or may not be naturally advantageous to the plant, in fact, it probably wasn't, because bitterness protected it from herbivory, from animals eating it, was then exploited by humans who were able to consume the sweet almond more easily. Similarly, in the case of the olive, wild olive does not produce a fruit. It produces a very small fruit. Therefore, the evidence suggests that olives were clonally propagated from a limited number of large fruit-producing plants. So what happens next is fascinating. Once the agricultural variety with larger fruits was found, it was grafted onto wild rootstock. So in effect, the ancient olive trees that we see today around Palestine are actually 2 trees. They were vegetatively or asexually propagated, and basically farmers channeled millions of years of evolution from beginning about 3 million years ago in the Pliocene period, when the summer rains receded. And as the area dried, waxy sclerophyllous leaf adaptations became advantageous. And in this way, ancient farmers channeled this evolutionary adaptation, resulting from basically a very deep time scale of incredible hardiness of the wild plant to produce olive trees. Recent studies have also interestingly shown that there is greater genetic diversity in the rootstock than in the productive canopy of the tree, which supports the idea that trees were domesticated from a limited number of trees with this mutation. Second, in Palestine, as with many parts of the Levant, our interviews with elders shows that they cared for and stewarded these ancient groves. So while it seems that wheat and barley and lentil took priority, olives had always been a source of oil and wood. When major crises came, as I said in the first part of this essay, they called upon these ancient groves to provide for their families, and we're seeing this today in Palestine. So they turned to a vegetative propagation, essentially using the productive part of the plant and regenerating it in the very literal sense. So elders in Palestine basically taught us how they did this, because we were we were wondering how so many trees got planted so quickly. So in lieu of seedlings produced in nurseries, of which there were some modern nurseries emerging in the 1970s and 80s, the traditional way, according to our oral histories, is that they would use a flat hand hoe called a toriye, which is common in Palestine. And they would hack off basically part of the base of the tree, which you can see at the bottom part. Here, there's kind of some shoots coming out of the root crown. And they would cut off a base of the tree, which is called in the vernacular a kormiye, which is actually coming into the Arabic from the Syriac and into the Syriac from Greek. And in botany, this root crown, the kormiye area, is called ovules or rounded areas at the root collar or root crown of the tree. So these round areas found at the base of the tree would be cut off at the end of the rainy season, and people would dig deep holes and they would bury them at the beginning of the next rainy season, at the end of the rainy season. And they would be basically planted in these holes and due to the collection of starchy material, the cutting from the root crown would enable adventitious root and shoot growth, and the root stubs are then emerge 2 to 3 years later, right out of the soil like magic. And then once you have that, at this point, an olive-producing scion, like a productive part of the tree, would be grafted onto the wild rootstock. In 7 to 10 years, the grafted tree would then start producing olives. So in other words, the olive forests that Palestinians brought forth over the last 100 years, in spite of and against attempts to erase them, were painstakingly regenerated and propagated from the ancient rootstocks and ancient trees dating back many hundreds of years. Regeneration from these traces in the landscape is what I call in a forthcoming essay, remnant agroecology. So if we go back to the opening question, why, when Palestinian small-scale agriculture, wheat and grain agriculture collapsed, did the olive tree cultivation not only survive, but thrive? I think we have to look both at the socioeconomic factors that we've discussed and have been discussed for many years. But I think looking at the biophysical life force that was channeled in this agroecological alliance of farmers with the deep genetic history of wild olive rootstock is also a big part of the story. In order to bring olive production to large areas of Palestine, they had to basically reach into this deep time scale and spread this amazing plant over the landscape. That spatial aspect, I am a geographer at the end of the day, is important, but I think the temporal aspect is also really important. The perenniality of this plant, the fact that the plant remains from year to year, is in part what has enabled the durability of this agricultural crop, and it's the last surviving agricultural crop of any major significance in Palestine. We have horticultural vegetable production, but olives are really the main show. So the adaptations in its wild rootstock gave the plant its durability. The elders we interviewed understood the biophysical features of this in their own way, and the potential of its perennial and wild growth habit. Okay. The last section I would like to share with you I'll share a little bit about our research methodology in our research group and pose some questions here. Small grain production in Palestine basically meant that Palestinian farmers bore the brunt of ecological crises. And I think we see this over and over. The human-induced ecological disturbance of plowing, for example, has had very serious deleterious agroecological effects, including erosion, soil organic matter loss, soil structure loss, nutrient loss, water loss, biodiversity loss, among many others. And I think the arboriculture, although in some ways a monocrop, provides a much different way of being. So the ways that we try to document this are through a group of research methods that we are currently engaged with. So our research group works to build more productive and perennial crop landscapes. We're particularly interested in the olive culture as a kind of infrastructure to build other crops into it, and intercropping, which would be known in the US as agroforestry or silvopasture, which includes animals. So it's made possible by a wonderful group of bright young researchers who I want to mention here: Yusra, Tala, Najla, Uthman, Siwar, Iyad, Ishraq, who have built this team together in Palestine here. This is in the springtime. We're looking at a crop that could be a potential forage feed for animals. We're building a base of potentially useful wild plants, identifying them, collecting their seeds, different seasons, and are interested in some of their possibilities. We're also using these plants to introduce them more and more into the community and make sure that that people and students are learning about them. This is a community day that we had in March at a library project. Of course, olive trees are a big part of that collection. These are our seedlings in the nursery. We're also trialing perennial grains that we are interested in, legumes specifically, that can be used for feeding animals. We're also interested in cover crops for tree crops that, for example, this is a study that we're doing in the central part of the West Bank, where we're looking at the difference between plowing under olive trees and mowing under olive trees. So on the left, the field is plowed, and on the right, the field was mowed. And it's kind of a painstaking process of weighing taking quadrat samples and weighing and identifying all of the plants. We found, for example, in a 1 meter by 1 meter quadrat in this field, 30, I think it was either 34 or 36 different species of wild plants growing up under the olive trees. And the last part of what we're doing is agroecological data structures, open source data structures that are compiling all of our data. We're trying to do that in a community engaged way, and hopefully responsible way. Yesterday in class with Professor Davis, we were talking a little bit about the importance of responsible sharing of data, which is, I think, increasingly difficult. The first little booklet we put out, which is available on archive.org, is called Palestinian Wild Food Plants. It's 25 plants. That led to a much larger project to basically try to document all the plants that are native to Palestine, about 2,000 species. We're up to 470 about, which is the first guide to basically wild plants in Palestine, comprehensive guide, shall we say. which includes local names, which is kind of fun because everyone argues over which of their local names is the correct name. This is one of my favorite trees. It's the Qayqab Qatlab tree. It's pretty cool. We also do a lot of GIS work. This is a study that my colleague Yusra and I did that was published in Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems, where we kind of looked at their village over time and showed how they were able to sustain their food production system. Yeah, lots of databases. Okay, so by way of concluding, I want to share with you a couple of questions. So if we are to continually learn from natural systems and build these agroecologies, that how might the olive tree offer insights? So one way to answer that question of why olives proliferated over Palestine over the last 100 years, we could say it was a community-driven biotic response to a crisis, a response invested with the deep time of millions of years of evolution in the rootstock, mutations providing the large fruit in the scion, and human ingenuity to bring these olives and this amazing oil crop to Palestinian families and feeding them now currently under this very difficult situation that we live in. So in a moment of crisis, during the collapse of the grain-based agroecology, they reached back into these remnant olive trees, themselves formed from grafting wild trees. At a moment with military occupation and men leaving for work in Israel to work in construction, this crisis precipitated a renewal. And this renewal sought to sustain their families, and actually, I would argue, ended up building a new society based on olive production. And importantly here, the crop did not come from outside of Palestine, but rather was regenerated from within the ancient trees. And it allowed for them to be part-time farmers in contrast to wheat and barley culture. So I want to just conclude with three questions. How might the transition to perennial crops generated from ancient trees show the way to future adaptations needed to sustain Palestinians and other marginalized people in the coming climate disruptions and crises? How might we relearn from our plant relations to have durable food production to sustain our communities? And finally, how might we learn from their deep timescales to enable our own deep adaptation? Thank you. Yeah, I can, sure. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. Couple questions. I'm curious, they're linked. How much native forest, quercus and pistacia, are actually, contiguous forests are left? And to what degree have you looked at how olive groves act as a true agroforestry system and replicate or as a replacement and contain sort of native species like birds and so on?
Yes. Great question. Thank you. Yeah, those species are around. As soon as we stop plowing, they come back. And so basically farmers now they're picking the olives right as we speak in October and November. When they go through to harvest, they often cut back those oak and pistachia species among many other species. There's about, I don't know, 12 or 15 kind of major species. The cornerstone species, the keystone species are those quercus and pistacia in our area. So they're around and they're kind of waiting to just have a little bit of room to breathe and less pressure from the goats and sheep. The way it works there is that kind of goats and sheep have free reign everywhere, basically. So for better or for worse. And so they're often chewing back the smaller trees also. There are some areas where the trees have been allowed to grow up into big trees, and sometimes people are surprised at the size of some of those trees. They get pretty big, but they tend to be in the 40, 50-year-old range, about, 8 or 9, 10 feet tall, and pretty small and scrubby, just because they haven't kind of had the chance to grow up. In terms of the agroforestry, I mean, I think in many ways we can consider it a traditional agroforestry system, because, it was, deliberately planted, and, 30 to 40 trees per acre is not very intensive, obviously, production system, but I think it's more sustainable because it's not irrigated. So once we get into irrigation, we get into all kinds of issues regarding control over the water and the long-term feasibility of those groves. So because they're grafting onto wild rootstock, they're actually able to tap into that drought resistance from the wild relative. So yeah, the challenge is really the tilling, in my opinion. It's the traditional way to come through and till, either with draft animals, because they're pretty small groves, or with tractors and larger groves. And it just really damages, as we're kind of finding out in sustainable agriculture. It's just one of the most important things, is to keep continuous root and living cover on the soil. So that trial that we're doing is actually to mow at 3 different times in the spring and see which timing is the best time to mow under the trees. You have to do something, and the options are kind of spray, mow, or till, because you have to be able to harvest the olives at some point. And you can't have, trees growing up in there. So we're hoping that mowing is the answer. More and more people are turning to mowing. More and more people are turning to spraying, just because it's so easy. And yeah, but it is interesting. And actually, in these terraces, like it's not super visible here. This is a very traditional dry stone terrace wall. And right kind of along the edge of these, kind of in between the terraces, you get a lot of biodiversity, a lot of trees growing up in the terraces, and they provide habitat for birds and animals, even, partridges, we call them rock rabbits, bunnies, and obviously for birds too. So they're really important habitat. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. We often, I'm not a scientist, right? So I'm not going to ask an agricultural question, but we often hear in the news that olive trees are a target.
Yes.
They're being cut down and chopped down
Yeah.
by Israelis or settlers.
Yeah.
What is the scale of that? And are Israelis planting olive trees, and what are the
Yeah.
olive trees? I see often. I just don't have a sense of the scale. Yeah.
The destruction tends to be seedlings, where people are trying to move into areas, their own land, that has been declared either a nature reserve or a settlement area, and they're trying to build it, like plant it out. And that's where you tend to get the army getting involved and taking out the seedlings. They tend to be usually smaller seedlings, like new plantings, at least today. And then because the older trees and because the way that the land law works, as you know, like the older trees are actually protective to some extent of the land tenure. And so it's that new planting of trees that usually is the most threatened. We also have Palestinian urban expansion, which is just brutal, you know, where there's been a kind of economic shifts in the villages now, where the land survey hadn't been completed in the northern parts of the West Bank, and a lot of the plots were still owned kind of by families, large extended families, and there'd be like 200 heirs, and you know, no one could really do much with the land. And in a way, as an environmentalist, I wasn't so upset because that protected the land from being built. But now they're dividing those up, and there's a new survey that's being done, a new Tabu system. Jordan never completed it, and now it's being completed, and it's causing a lot of construction in the villages. And unfortunately at the expense of olive trees. But I thought I knew stuff about agriculture in Palestine. And then when I discovered that olive trees were expanding so much, it was pretty interesting, kind of surprising. Yeah.
So, thank you. You told us a lot about the ecology and the historical dimensions of it. I wondered if you could just talk a little more about the market for olives.
Yeah.
And how that factors in.
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, the local, this is what's kind of fascinating about this, is that there's more than 300 or about 300 presses in the West Bank, which is a small area. The parts of the Midwest that I'm from, it would be about 4 counties. So it's pretty impressive if I think like in US terms, in agricultural areas, let's say 300 dairies or 300 creameries in 4 counties is a lot. And so that processing is really quite striking, that we still have that amazing kind of economic pillar to stand on, that we can process our own olives even despite all of these restrictions. So to answer your question, most of the oil is going to local consumption, which is, again, in the kind of situation that we find ourselves in, where we have to import most of our food now. We went from like inventing bread and wheat to importing bread and wheat. So that's really helpful to be able to have the olive oil. In terms of global markets, there are several companies now that are marketing Palestinian olive oil abroad. There's one in Jenin in particular that is a very large company that is certified organic, and USDA organic and EU certified organic, as well as fair trade certified, and is marketing olive oil in the US and Europe. Most of the olive oil, probably that Palestinian olive oil that you can buy here is through that grower cooperative. And there, I think the thinking is that, you know, if we can create a market, if we can create a higher price than the local market, then that will encourage more people to plant more trees and grow more olives and make it a more valuable crop. And I think that there is some merit to that argument. They have been planting a lot of trees, and the farmers growing for those cooperative, for that fair trade association, they do get a higher price than the others. And the other cool thing about that in particular is that they can introduce innovations in the farming system through the association. And for example, mowing instead of tilling. So I think over the last year, it's been available in Whole Foods and on the internet and stuff from some of these companies. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Olive, whatever crops are you considering and also I think historic oak.
Yeah.
For acorns is flower, or contemporary interest in that, or other species of chestnut, sweet chestnut.
Yeah. Yeah, not so much. The short answer is basically, I think there are some other trees, like carob, kharrub, that can be, actually carob in English is an Arabic word, or probably even before Arabic, word, the kharrub, and that's a really cool crop, that we have in the Tulkarem and Qalqilia area. Okay. No worries.
There.
Yes,
There.
okay, I have a question here too. And I think that that could be something that has been off and on an important crop for fodder. And you can feed it to animals. You can make an amazing dibis kharrub, the carob molasses, which is really good. And there's other things that you can make with it too. So in terms of the acorns, I can't find, well, I take that back. Some of the interviews that we've had have said that people as a famine food would eat acorns, balut, but it's you know, you really have to process it a lot to get it to be edible. And I know there are Native American traditions in North America of using acorns. There are some other crops that are not perennial, that are also you know, on the border between animal and human food, that are more kind of famine foods, I would guess. And so we've been trying to document a lot of this. Some of it is in the archaeobotanical literature, some of it is in the historical literature, some of it's just with the last generation of people, basically now in their 80s, who lived in that world before fossil fuels and so on. So yeah, there's about 2,000, more than 2,000 native plants in the historic Palestine. So it's pretty diverse. Yes.
Yeah, how much the olive tree areas fall in, you know, area A, B, and C?
Yeah.
And, you know, how does this affect farmers' access and even your research and your ability, you know, to do this kind of work?
Thank you, Dr. Sharif. It's always fun to take questions from people whose work you've been reading for years. Thank you. Yeah, area A, B, and C, it's our work, it's become very, very difficult to. Oh, sorry. Area A, B, and C came after the Oslo Accords in 1994. It divided up the West Bank and Gaza into areas under Israeli control, Palestinian control, and shared control. Even though they don't, I mean, they have an effect on the ground, but yeah, it's hard for us to work, especially in the last year. Moving around has become very difficult. Coming here was one of the last times, or one of the only times in the last year that I've even left my town of Ramallah, because it's just, you know, it's kind of not worth it unless you really have to leave. So yeah, it's pretty scary right now because October, November, everyone needs to be out and collecting the olives. And we're just all holding our breath. I was seeing some reports of people being attacked and by settlers, but it's just such an important part of people's food, especially during this time, that we really need to be able to get out and harvest it. But yeah, we're pretty able, as long as you're not too close to a settlement or a settler road, usually okay to be in your land. But or if you have to go through a dangerous road to get to your land is also an issue. So yeah, but it's been much more difficult to collect stories and oral histories and seeds and yeah. There's a question online that asks about sheep and goats and animals, and yeah, I would love to be able to do something about, where we can integrate goats and sheep into the production system. They're kind of at opposing almost, well, I don't know. I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to envision a way that can really work very intensively that is managed, because there are olive farmers who have goats, but most of the people who have goats, many of them are not farmers, or are farmers of other things, not necessarily olives, at least in our area. So getting them to kind of work together, or figuring out ways where olive farmers can have sheep and goats in their olives is an interesting challenge. It's kind of a cultural, I mean, it's similar everywhere in the world between farmers and ranchers. And so, yeah, but it's really important because we have to find ways to feed the animals. That's almost all of the feed is imported. So aside from like January, February, March, April, when they can graze, the rest of the year they have to feed them with imported grain. So yeah. Other questions? Yes.
I don't have a sense of where this is going, but do you see room for further expansion on that, or are you at kind of a limit in terms of our cultivation?
Definitely limited by settlement expansion and Palestinian urban expansion also. Not so much urban expansion, it's more village expansion and urban expansion. But Israel also has a network of nature reserves, which it uses to kind of block off and restrict land from Palestinians, so that they don't actually change the land tenure. They don't change the owner, but they just put a kind of restriction on it, so that you can't plant new trees, or you can't build a house, or you can't do stuff on your own land. And that is greatly limiting the ability of people to expand. Sometimes those are olive groves. So then it's kind of a weird situation where you can till usually in Area C, and you can usually collect if it's not too close to a settlement or too close to a road that's dangerous, you can usually access it. But any kind of development or construction, or it's the construction that really gets them in Area C. They come in and stop it immediately usually. So, and interestingly, actually, just one small side note on that, if you plant wheat and olives, usually they don't mess with you. And this is obviously, we're talking about people on their own land, that's kind of striking. But if you plant olives, then they start getting excited about what you're doing and usually come in. And that's where Professor Fidel, it's that question is just, that's where they'll come in and take out with a bulldozer, take out the saplings. Saplings are usually about a year old. People usually plant them at a year or 2 years old. So, yes.
Just 2 minutes ago, Reuters reported that over 600 trees have been destroyed in West Bank, and it's kind of strange to go through Reuters report. The language is very biased towards the occupation, and one of the top lines is that Israel is investigating genuine making harvest secure. What does that really mean? Like, for me, reading from here, it seems like it's a blatant lie. You've stayed in Palestine for 11 years. Is it any different, or is it even worse?
Well, I mean, there are I'm not sure of the exact number, but there are many, many, many olive trees in Palestine. So 600 is a lot, but it's not really that much. You know, and so often those are seedlings, as I mentioned, and they would be new plantations. So on the one hand, you know, when those trees are taken out, people replant them right away. And so it's obviously there's a restriction and there's an attempt to suppress Palestinian olive production, but you know, we are tough and people are just they just replant them and they go somewhere else and they plant them and they, you know, they figure out ways. So it's a very, very, very tough tree and a very, very tough, and people are, as the olive oil becomes increasingly important, you know, it's becoming an important economic factor. Like right now, I mentioned people left farming to go to construction over the last 30, 40 years. Well, all of those permits were canceled a year ago. Like probably 90% of them were canceled. And so people are now actually returning to their olives in ways and fixing terraces and spending more time taking care of their olives than they did before, because they have more time and they don't have other income, and they see the income now from the trees. And I think, you know, a teneke, which is about 17 or 18 kilos of oil, goes for about 500 to 600 shekels, which is, I don't know exactly how much that is in dollars, but it's yeah. So it's a fairly valuable crop and pretty easy to produce because the trees are so strong. Yeah. I don't want to hold you guys here. I'm having fun, but yes. Yeah. 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 It's yeah. Yeah.
I understand that the role of agriculture, like everywhere else, economically has really gone down.
Yeah.
Like
Yes.
5% or whatever.
Yes.
The GDP. So how can this be, you know, very important if
Yeah.
the whole agricultural sector economically I'm talking about?
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, I'm trying to figure out.
Other than for kind of consistency.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, if I could figure it out, I would take you back to the map of the presses, but it was really striking to me to see that there are 300 presses in the West Bank, and that's a pretty decentralized, you know, strong network of processing. So it's one thing to produce things, and it's another thing to have the infrastructure to process them and distribute them. And so yeah, it is, I think, more as a way of surviving and having food than it is an economic thing. So
To build on Sharif's question, I mean, that, when you grow your own olives, produce them, go have them pressed, and then bring the olive oil home and then distribute it to your family, does that get counted in the GDP?
exactly.
I would imagine that some of these real subsistence practices are completely outside of the statistics, and
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of also your point, right?
Yeah.
There's a way that people are functioning outside of
Exactly.
systems, governments.
Yeah. I even know Arab American families that have olives. There's villages that have historically, you know, moved to the US, and they go home for the olive harvest and take the oil back with them. And there's even ads, you know, in this time of year usually is like ship your oil to the US, and there's companies that actually specialize in shipping the oil to their relatives all over the US. Yep, there you go. Yeah. Thank you. Sure, love to. Thanks very much. Seems like that space. Yeah. How long has it been?
Then sort of.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Priscilla. And then should we take him to lunch?
Our thoughts on we have two more right here, so.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You were here long before I was.
What's your favorite?
Well, I think this is, I mean, it's, you know, and there's all people work with.
The underbrush, they're always concerned about underbrush because the fire. Yeah, do you specialize in particular areas or?
Mostly.